Hello, welcome to Felixstowe TV. This is, I believe, the 1st of February, so you should have said white rabbits this morning when you woke up. But 60 years ago on this day, this town would have been facing devastation of a type it had never seen before. Losses that we should all reflect on. I have 3 guests here today, and we also have an audience of 2, so we could have guests of 5 really, but we're limited. We're a community television organisation. But you're going to introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Felix Newson, and I was 10 at the time of the flood, and I lived at Felixstowe Ferry.
So really, the area, the other side of the peninsula, down at the ferry, yes, you can give a nice input for that, because we've been concentrating pretty much where the deaths occurred, but that's a nice balance. And you, sir?
Yes, my name's Malcolm Allen. I was living in Langer Road at the time, and I was 12 years of age.
Right. How far down Langer Road were you living?
I was, I don't know whether many people will know the area, but there are buildings down there and the River of Life Church now, and we live right opposite there.
So we're beyond Walton Avenue?
Beyond Walton Avenue.
And you're where the Sangamo factory used to be?
Exactly.
Okay. And young lady?
Hello, my name's Carol Josie, and at the time of the flood I was 4, my sister was 6½. We lived in the next terrace to Malcolm.
Did you really?
Near the Coast Guard station and just across the road from the ill-fated prefabs.
And you brought a friend with you today?
Yes, my dear little teddy bear.
Right, and it was because it was left on a settee that it survived itself?
Yes.
Okay, yesterday I believe you all attended the commemoration service at the memorial that we now have. What did you think of the service itself?
Yes, I thought it was very good. First time I've been down there to a service, but I have obviously seen the memorial when I've been passing.
Right.
Yeah, I thought that was very well done.
Uh-huh. And the vicar, you thought?
Yeah, I think
appropriate words,
yes,
etc.,
I think he spoke. But then we didn't lose anybody, and it might be a different matter if we'd have lost relations.
Right. And what I should have told our viewer is today's interview would have been being undertaken by Ian Healy. Sadly, perhaps as a result of yesterday, he's gone down with a head cold, and one would assume he's got to get himself fit for tomorrow's service at the Salvation Army, which I think is a further service of remembrance. So get well, Ian, soon, and we'll welcome you back quickly. Right, Malcolm, you were in the house.
Asleep.
Asleep.
Yes, this was around about 12:30 at night, and the next thing I seem to remember, my dad had got up and said, the water is coming in. And although the memory is a bit hazy, he apparently went downstairs because he'd spotted that there was a car outside, which couldn't get up Langer Road towards Ipswich. He went and opened the front door, let the people in.
So where was the water at that point?
The water at that point was about halfway up the wheel of the car.
So it would have come into the house?
And it was starting to come in over the bottom step of the house.
Right.
So he managed to get the door open. The people came in. He couldn't then shut the door because the water had come up that quick.
So it was forcing
the door back. And by the time they got upstairs and got into our front bedroom, looked out of the window, the car had been turned round and the water was lapping the roof.
So it floated off down?
And it just, I don't remember whether it floated, but it just basically disappeared under the water.
Right. So how many members of your family were there?
There was my mother and my father, myself, my aunt with her eldest son there, and then 6 people out of the car.
It strikes me as a very, very crowded...
It was crowded.
First floor?
It was very crowded upstairs, but we were dry.
Indeed. So where did the water... I mean, I take it you had the car, you had the surge, you all went upstairs. At what point did the water then start to rise so it virtually got to the ceiling of...
It was rising very quickly all the time.
So it was a continuous process?
It was a continuous process. My dad was going backwards and forwards along the landing, checking on the water level, then deciding how and if we could all get up into the loft.
Exactly, because that would have been your
and
next...
we got to a point where it just did not rise anymore, but it was one step from the landing.
Right. So the thing I've always had difficulty with, and with the war, with the actual flood memorial, is that blue line that shows, and that may well have been the settled level of water at some point, but it strikes me it couldn't possibly have been, you know, the surge, the top of the crest. It
possibly wasn't. I mean, I don't remember how high the water was apart from in the house.
Yeah.
But we have to remember that the most of the water came from the river.
Yes, indeed.
And it would not have been as active as the sea.
No.
In respect of, it was a smaller channel and perhaps not quite the roughness that the sea water was showing.
But it did carry a number of large items over the railway line itself, didn't it? Right over the top.
Yeah, so an awful lot of items. I mean, we had a dead pig in our hallway.
Did you?
The next morning.
Right.
All sorts of animals were sort
yeah,
of
I'm told the
suffered
animal
like
loss
that,
was
so,
huge, because
yeah,
a lot of people
course.
used to run animals down
Well,
on the marshes, did they not?
yes,
you know,
were.
I know an elderly guy who used to run chickens and things.
Yes, indeed.
And he said it was devastating for him.
On the
you know.
allotments as well, of course, just opposite.
Oh, there are. Oh,
There are
yes,
pigs
of
on
course.
there,
Yes, dig for victory.
Mm-hmm.
In those days. Right, we're on to you and Teddy. We did a little bit yesterday, didn't we?
We certainly did.
So we don't really. I mean, what we can tell you is the film we shot yesterday at the memorial. Our editor-in-chief has worked very diligently, and it should now be up on the website for you to see. So, what yesterday came to mind that we didn't discuss?
Well, there's one or two things that I can't remember, but either my sister or I can remember my parents telling us.
Family members.
And talking about the movement of the water.
Yes.
One thing I can remember my dad telling me in years and years later, when he was like Malcolm's father, standing on the landing watching the water, every time there was a swell,
Yes.
it affected the air pressure, and it literally made him catch his breath. He
Right.
said it was like when you put your foot in a bath of cold water, you know.
Because
So
I
there
suppose
was some
we forget. I
movements.
take it the wind was still
very
raging.
much, very much.
And I remember the what was it, the 86, 87 storm. And I was sent by my wife outside in the midst of that at 3 a.m. to cut up a tree that had fallen into Back Lane. Stupid thing to do, but exactly the same thing happens in that type, because you get this big push, then it dies, and then it does it again, and it's a very strange. So you would have experienced that type of weather,
Well,
as
obviously,
well
yeah,
as.
yeah.
Yeah.
And another thing my dad did, which I can vaguely recollect, I don't know how much water was in the house at that time. He was on the landing.
Right.
And he had the idea of getting hold of an old blackout blind pole.
Oh, yes, there were a few of
and
those.
reaching out from the stairs, he
Right.
managed to unhook all our coats from the hooks in the hall.
Did he really?
So we were glad, you know, he retrieved those.
Yeah.
And then, like Malcolm's house, you know, it came almost to the top of the stairs.
I mean, now they say, what would you rescue if your house was on fire, don't they? And we wouldn't think of a coat, but what we do think of are family photographs and that type of thing, because the rest of it's replaceable, isn't it? Really? Can we go back down to the ferry? So whilst this was happening in Langer Road,
It was
because you must have been hit slightly before.
before, yes.
Because you'd have had the sea, wouldn't you?
you-
And
well,
the Deben.
we-
I
we
don't know
had
what
s-
happened to Woodbridge.
Well, I should imagine they had floods up in Woodbridge
Yeah.
as well. And I know it broke the banks of both walls, both
Right.
river walls, so it went all over the marshes towards Ramsholt, I know that.
Yes.
But we had it, but we didn't know how serious that was going to be, but my mother had the job of, they just built a new toilet block at the ferry,
Oh, yes.
and she was employed by the council to lock the doors every night at 10:30. When she went down to lock the doors, she couldn't get anywhere near. There was already water round.
So
Now,
it'd come up the slip,
It
and it was.
had come over the beach.
So the cafe would have been
The cafe,
under.
well, that used to come round the cafe every
It did,
spring
did
tide
it? It
anyway,
did,
years
yeah,
ago.
yeah.
But what happened was that there was a fisherman down there called Barry White. He's the late father of John White, the now harbour master.
Oh yes.
And there was Mr. Charlie Brinkley, although my mother never saw him at the time. But Mr. White told my mother, "Get your family up. Me and my brother have gone to bed.
Right.
Wake them up, get them up to our house because I think there's going to be a flood." Because there was still 2 hours to go for the flood time.
And there was no, in those days there was no radio as such, no telephone.
No.
So there wasn't any phone ahead warning.
No phone ahead warnings.
So unless you had somebody who knew the area,
yes, well they would
and questioned where it already was,
they would be down there looking after their boats anyway.
Absolutely.
And making sure that they didn't go adrift. And he saved our lives.
Yes, he did.
By telling, because we were able to get up to his house in Harbour Villas, number 3.
Right.
And we got up there without getting wet. Now what happened was they, over the night,
Right.
Mr. Brinkley, Freddie Pierce, the son of the boat builder, he was also a boat builder at
Right.
the ferry, and Charlie Brinkley were out in their boats saving all the people from the lower lying bungalows on the the side of the sea wall, which wasn't, they weren't protected from the sea wall by the sea wall.
No.
But our problem was, which if we hadn't have got out of our bungalow,
Yes.
the sea water came up to the top of the wall,
Yes.
and as it went over, it breached it. Now it breached that at such a force that our bungalow, although it was on legs into the ground,
Right.
and had a brick chimney and had a a telegraph pole at
Right.
the end,
Yes.
was pushed about a yard
Off its footing.
off its footing. But luckily we weren't inside,
No, right.
because we were very low there. We were probably the lowest spot of the ferry.
Right. We did say previously, though, that for the ferry, this was a reoccurrence.
Yes.
This was another
Yes.
visitation of the sea, because you
Yes.
did have a
We
flood
had
in 49.
We had a flood in 49, but it was during the day. They come at spring tides.
Right.
This
Yes.
is what happens. They come at spring tides, and spring tides here
Yes.
are between about 11:30 and 3 o'clock.
Yes.
That's when the spring tides come. Even when they alter the clock, that doesn't vary much from
Right.
that. So the high waters here
Yes.
are when we get a northwesterly wind,
Indeed.
and on top of spring tides. That's when it's really worth. But we were at school, at the ferry school, round Ferry Road.
Oh, up on the hill.
So
Yes.
we heard that Albert's bus was floating. That's the rumour that went round. But we were able to get to the ferry
Yes.
by walking along the top of the bunkers. Not the bunkers, but there's a big high bit between the road and the Martello Tower. There's a high spot.
Yes, there is,
You can
yeah.
carry on walking along there, although
Right.
the golf course was flooded.
Right.
And we then spent a week with Mr. White's family.
Did you?
Because we were friends with the boys
Yeah.
anyway.
Uh-huh.
And before our place dried out, the water was probably a week draining from the golf course.
Oh,
So
yeah.
we knew all about that in 1949 anyway, but I
Right.
was only 7 then.
Right. I'm told that the Air Force turned up with very big air blowers that they used through Langer Road and elsewhere. Did they get down to the ferry, or did you have to catch for yourself?
No, we catered for ourselves down there.
Right.
When we were flooded out, we were billeted after we stayed with our uncle in Ferry Road,
Right.
near the church,
Uh-huh.
for 3 weeks, and then they opened up the Marlborough Hotel. And we lived in the Marlborough Hotel for 2.5 months.
So you should.
And we
Yes.
should, but we were with a lot of the Felixstowe flood victims from Langer Road and all
Yeah.
around. You see, so we picked up a lot of information from them.
Indeed you did.
But and obviously we lived here all our lives, so
Yes.
we know what happened.
It does. But I suppose the experience you had in 49 didn't actually happen in Langer Road or Felixstowe, did it?
I don't
One would
believe-
assume
I don't
because
believe so.
I mean, I've done a little research, not enough, and I'm very much moved to do a lot more research to do something this September for the Heritage Open Day. But what seems to be the case, there was a survey of all the river walls done in 37 before WW2 started. And at that point the surveyor was saying that they really were in desperate need of repair. So it would appear they stayed that way until 53, when they were not capable of fulfilling the function. And the real question is, we spent an awful lot on our frontage, haven't we? We spent,
Yes.
what, 21 million plus?
Yes.
What have we actually spent on the rivers yet? Because that's where the risk was, wasn't it?
It was then.
The risk from the ferry, after the 1949 flood, they heightened the river wall.
Oh, they did do something.
They heightened,
Right.
they had the excavators down and
Yeah.
drag lines, they called them.
Right.
And they topped up the top of the river wall, so it was about 3 foot higher than what it was in 49, but it still breached in 53.
So it breached it.
It
so
came
it
over-
doesn't really
it
need
came-
to overtop it. But
It
could
well,
breach
it probably did overtop
Yeah.
it, but we weren't there to watch,
No, we weren't.
luckily. But it probably did do that, a bit like the Dam Busters raid once they broke those
What,
dams.
do that
properly,
bottom
once
bit,
that
it
water
just
comes
dissolves
through.
and falls in, doesn't it?
Yes, I think
Yeah.
that's probably what happened. But since then,
Yes.
they have sheet piled that wall.
Oh,
that
good.
That particular river wall, up to what
So
we
does
call
that go all the
style.
way to the sort of the top where
That
you've
goes.
got
That goes
that
to
bank
the.
through?
That goes to the meeting point of where the river wall comes from the golf house.
Yes.
There's a river wall there separating the golf course. Well, it's still it's golf course over there now, but
Yeah.
in years gone by it was farmland.
Yes.
And
You mean the extra 9 holes?
yes.
Yeah,
So, but
okay.
it separates that. So that wall.
Right.
That wall's not been done, and as
No.
far as I know, that's never been topped up.
Okay.
It may have been when they did the sea defence at Brackenbury. They carted a lot of soil down there somewhere.
I'm sure they did. So what we had on that particular night was a very low depression in the Atlantic that took a huge amount of water up the Irish Channel,
Yeah.
whereby I believe a steamer was actually sunk en route. When it got to the north of Scotland, instead of proceeding for some strange reason, it did a 180-degree turn
Yeah.
and forced all of that water down an ever narrowing throat,
Yes.
where it then hit us. But I'm also told two things, and whether you knew it at the time or after, I don't know, but apparently the harbour master at Harwich rang the police station here, and he did exactly the same as Mr. White said. The tide should have turned an hour ago, and it's still rising.
Yeah, I don't think it was so much the tide should have turned. The fact was that when the ebb tide went out, it was held up by that strong gale,
Yes.
and it was almost like an ordinary high water on a neap tide, and then it came in again. So I
Yes.
think it probably did flow the time it was supposed to, which was about high water about 1 o'clock, I believe.
Well, I don't know. I understand here we didn't have the coincidence of the peak of the surge and the top of the tide. There was a gap between them. What I'm saying is the scenario we have is pretty bad, but it could actually have been worse, because the surge was also starting to move off towards Holland, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, we sit here and say, well, it was awful, but it could have been
Well,
even more terrifying.
Well, it
I
would
mean,
have-
your Langer houses could have been into the first floor.
Well, it would have been at the ferry, definitely. If the wall hadn't broken or topped to go onto the marshes, we'd have had all that water at the ferry, and that would have been worse.
So you-
But most of us, they evacuated people, Barry White and
Yes.
Charlie Brinkley and Freddie Pearce and Harry Howe. who
So
was
they're
running
all
about.
with torches in the dark, or,
Well, they
or
were in
was
the
it a
d-
moonlit
There
night?
was a moonlight.
Right.
It was moonlit,
Right.
but to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But that was still
Freezing.
dangerous,
Oh, right.
and they did very well doing that.
Yes.
But they took some people to the ferry boat, which we weren't. We weren't at the ferry boat, so we didn't know about theirs.
Oh, right.
But we knew when they were bringing people into the Harbour Villas, because the electricity had gone off. We got a coal fire, and they were drying. People were stripping off and drying by the fire.
Right,
And
I bet.
there was probably over 20 people in there.
Really amazing.
Yeah.
But then that was at that time the ferry was a community of fishermen and people,
Yes.
and
Yes.
I suppose what happened to RAF Bordsey as
Well,
this was going on?
my sister and elder brother were in the cinema in Felixstowe at up till 10:30 when the last
Oh,
bus
right.
brought them home.
Yeah.
And in the cinema, they put a notice over on the screen
Yeah.
that RAF personnel from RAF Bordsey to report to RAF Felixstowe because the ferry had been suspended. The foot ferry couldn't get off the quay. The wind was so strong.
Oh, right.
It couldn't get away from the quay when he'd previously done it, so he wouldn't risk it again. So, in other words, he
Close it.
notified them that
Yeah.
they'd got to go down there, which was bad news for them, really.
Yeah.
Although I don't think any drowned because of that.
No, there was one, I think.
There was
RAF guy,
one
wasn't
drowned,
there,
but
who
whether he
did
was
drown.
drowned, whether he was at the dance, I think he may have been at the
Okay.
dance. There was a dance at the pier, and
Okay, if we move on to we're now into the aftermath, aren't we? We're the morning after. I'm told that a guy going to work came down the hill, Garrison Lane, and ran straight into the water, knowing none of it was there. And sort of how I'm hearing sort of conflicting things from different folks. Some are saying that they actually were warned in their prefab. Was that the case? I was under the illusion that this struck without anybody knowing it was coming at them. So there seems to be a bit of uncertainty there, because we were told, or the record shows, that certainly the borough folk went off to the ferry because that's where you'd been hit last.
Yes.
And when they came back, they dispersed and went home, because apparently they took a boat down and did.
Well,
that's what the report says.
Yeah,
so
I didn't hear anything about that.
Okay,
But
so I think we've got a bit of work to do.
Well, what I did hear,
this year.
what is good.
Yeah.
Alan Jobson wrote a book, The Felixstowe Story.
Yes, I've read
and in
that.
that book, he does say that there was people from Harwich ringing up the Coast Guards here. And then I also heard talk over the years that there was a night watchman at the dock had rung the police station saying that it was already 6 feet over the high water mark, and that it was going to be bad.
Yeah.
And evidently there was a policeman who biked
Yes,
down
you did.
along Langer Road, evidently, but of course I wouldn't know. We wouldn't know.
No,
that.
you wouldn't have known.
No, we
because
wouldn't
you've
know.
got this guy, haven't you, who's sort of the one
Yes.
who's carrying the child.
Yes.
I don't know which camera you are, but that one, and we'll add it in later. So we really get into the sad bit now. You were safe in Harper Villas. You were moved somewhere different, or did you stay in your home?
We stayed in a home overnight,
Right.
and then the next morning one of the local doctors, Dr. Levick,
Right.
was out in a rowing boat coming along to see if anybody needed help.
Right.
And me being diabetic, I needed an insulin shot.
Oh, right.
So I was carried downstairs, popped into the rowing boat, taken back to the old Cavendish Hotel,
Yes, yes.
as it
the
was
centre,
then,
wasn't it?
and then up to Felixstowe Hospital.
Right.
And then later in the day, and I can't remember when, but reunited with my mum and dad.
So, how were you accommodated during the period of sort of trying to get the homes back into some sort of state?
We stayed with friends up on Coronation Drive.
Right.
Because my dad worked at the RAF station
Right.
as a civilian driver, and he got friends there who were living on high ground.
So you all fixed yourselves up, and you did the same, didn't you?
Yes, we did.
Sort of, and
Yes,
your sister had the delight of going off to Luton, sunny Luton in February. You can imagine how wonderful that must have been.
Yes.
For her.
Yes. Yes, I guess my dad must have carried us all to the top of the garden, which was probably pretty well unaffected because of the slope of the
Yes, the
incline
property
towards
is
the Coast
there.
Guard station.
Uh-huh.
And they retrieved what blankets and clothes and possessions they could.
Right.
And my sister was left in the pram on the garden path, absolutely terrified,
Really.
because the wind was just so ferocious.
And this was the morning after. It was still
Yes.
blowing.
Yeah, oh yes,
Not
yes.
quite so much.
Yeah, but she was really terrified.
Big storm.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. And
I mean, that's a big storm. It's still
to be left
Mm.
in the pram by herself for the most part,
Yeah.
and she was 6. She didn't know whether the water was going to come back, and she was just trapped in the pram, I suppose.
Yes, in her mind.
So probably the wind had dropped to a certain degree, but it was still very, very strong.
So you ended also getting to the Cavendish, did you?
We didn't actually go to the Cavendish
Oh, right.
because my mum was so desperate to get to higher ground.
Oh, really?
She just wanted to
Get out of
get
there.
to the town.
Oh, right.
So we didn't go to the Cavendish, and we eventually managed to pick our way across Wireless Green, which was a quagmire
Oh,
because
I
it was where the water from the flood water from the river had met the water that had washed over
From the
from
sea.
prom.
So you had the overtopping and
So
yes.
I
it-
really don't know how they managed to get a heavily laden pram
Through
over
there.
that marsh.
No.
But
no.
we got to Bridge Road and we spent the next night there.
Oh, right.
My sister's got no recollection of what we did for food, whether we had anything to eat that day, because we'd have lost all our food.
Yes, you would have
And the
done.
flood shops weren't open, and probably were no cafes were open.
So what happened to the WRVS? Didn't they sort of swing into action? There was nobody turned
Well,
up?
probably at the
we
Cavendish.
never saw them.
No.
We walked to the golf house
Yes, yes.
the next day.
Yeah.
The golf course still flooded,
Yeah.
apart from this high bit that you could walk along.
Right.
And we were then, when we got there, we were told that that's where we should have gone, but there was no way we could get there that night. There was no way we could have got there because we could have been cut off. In the 49 flood, there was a car cut off on the road.
Yeah.
Whether I don't know what happened to the driver. He wasn't drowned, but the car was left there.
Right.
But and I can always remember that was the first time I'd had tomato soup, and I don't like it. But that was the first bit of food that we'd had.
Really?
We hadn't had any food all night. We'd been awake all night because although we were in Harbour Villas,
Right.
our mother unfortunately had left Harbour Villas and gone to console a lady who was hysterical in a house called Fairhaven near the Victoria. She hadn't told us she was going. And then my older brother, who was 19,
Right.
and he was in the Air Force National Service, but he was stationed at Felixstowe Compassionate Posting. And he didn't tell us either, but when he found out Mother was not there, he left to go and see where she'd gone. He was told where she had gone. And Fairhaven was a house that got two doors. One was up some steps and one was on a lower level.
Right.
And when he knocked on the lower level one, where he'd only gone up to his sort of knee, just over his knees, the lady wouldn't open the door, made him go round to the other steps, and in doing so, he nearly got swept away because he was up to his chest in water. And he spent the night with us, but he was wet because we eventually found out where they'd gone. Where they gone. So we walked at about 1:30. Well, it must have been about. We didn't have watches in those days, and it was dark, and although it was moonlight, but we walked out of the seaside door of the Harbour Villas.
Right.
And we didn't get our feet wet, and we were able to walk to that house. And by that time, she did open the lower door because the water had gone down. It subsided.
Right.
And we spent that night freezing to death on the stairs with no heat, no blankets or anything. But I just think how cold that must have been on those prefabs.
Awful. I mean, I just can't envision.
It's unimaginable.
And it is, and I mean, there seems to be reference of folk in night dresses.
Yeah.
On the roof,
Yeah.
huddling together.
Yeah, and if they had wet clothes,
I mean, it defies the imagination, doesn't it? And I suppose we can be nearly content that if such a thing were to occur, at least we'd be warned in plenty of time, and we would hopefully have a system that would work, and we wouldn't get into. I mean, from what you're all saying, it looked as if you were left to shift for yourselves, pretty much. You know, and. What I'm finding strange is that this is 53, 8 years after you'd had WW2, which was supposedly pretty well organised, and it should have all been there, shouldn't it, really? But I suppose, I don't know. I mean, was it a bit like when we had the big hurricane, because we were left to shift for ourselves then, wasn't it? I mean, all we had was lots of problems that Kew Gardens in London had been hit, but nothing got out to Suffolk. No. Bit got into Essex, but perhaps that's our fate for living in such a lovely part of the country, that we're left to fend for ourselves.
When we were walking up from the ferry to the golf house, our uncle and his cousin were saving horses that had been stood on the marshes all night, up to their necks in water. And they were rescuing those in boats. They'd previously rescued people out of the farmhouse called Home Hills, and also there was a little house near the King's Fleet.
Yes, indeed, there is.
They'd rowed and rescued those, but it was daylight then. It wasn't quite as bad because the water had receded. That water was still up over the side of the wall, so it was kept from going away. But they got the Queen's Medal of Brave Conduct for that.
Really?
And yet Barry White and Charlie Brinkley and Freddie Pearce, incidentally, walked from the ferry during the night on the high part of that cliff, the only place, to summon a doctor, because the only casualty from the ferry was a Miss Vera Broom, who'd been injured when she was being poked through the kitchen window of the ferry boat in. And had she stayed in her cottage, it turned out she would have been okay, but she was panicking, and called for help, and they rescued her and poked her through there, and she died a few days later.
I thought she did of hypothermia.
That was either hypothermia,
yes,
or I think she ruptured her varicose veins going through the window, but I don't know what she died.
Moving on to a sadder event, one would assume we didn't realise at the time we had 41 casualties. I think the first count was about 33, 34. We obviously moved to a point of funerals and things. You were what age at that time?
I was nearly 11. I was 10.
You were only 12. You were 4. So one would assume, though they may have been going on, it would have been what, more the adults or whatever.
Yes.
Because somebody was telling me yesterday, on the way to the Cavendish, there were a number of sort of bodies who'd been rescued but were covered and were there. So it must have been quite a long period of funerals and.
Yes.
It must have been a very sombre time, all through the town and beyond.
We walked to the Cavendish on the Monday.
Right.
We must have. I think our uncle who was saving those horses, he lived in Ferry Road, as I said, so we went to live with them. So we must have been living there, but we went because they were giving out clothes, and of course we hadn't got any. We'd only got the clothes we stood up in.
That's what I'm finding quite surprising.
So we had to go to the Cavendish to get the clothes. That was all we went for, really.
Right.
And that was the first day I saw a helicopter. That was the first day, and we lived at the ferry where you saw any amount of aeroplanes.
Yes, indeed.
Because there was a lot of activity, aeroplanes about here in those days.
Right.
And but that was the first helicopter we saw.
Right. Amazing. So Morecambe, what would you like to reflect on from a point of view? There's a bit in today's Star, and it does cover yesterday's event quite well, saying, could this happen again? Which is always the question, and we're never ready for it, even when it happens again. But you've seen the sort of sea defences that have been designed by computer in Croydon and built by somebody else from somewhere else. What sort of level of confidence do you have in the? We've got the coastal defences, and then we've got the rivers.
Well, yes.
So how do you feel about? And do you still live in Langer Road?
No.
Do you live on higher ground now?
I've long since moved to higher ground.
Right, and do you live on higher ground or lower?
Well, we lost our house. Mother, because we'd had a flood in '49. I think she panicked and thought next time we're going to not be so lucky. She accepted. Well, didn't originally, but we accepted £175 for the loss of our bungalow.
Really?
But we were told we could build again. And then that turned out that wasn't going to be the case.
Right.
And but we were, like a lot of other flood victims,
Yes.
Given council. Well, not given them, but we
Yes,
were
allocated one.
Yeah.
Right.
In Stour Avenue, Deben Way, I think a few went, and Waveney Road.
Oh, right.
A lot of flood victims ended up there.
Right.
Because that was then when they were building that estate.
Indeed.
And
so you, Carol, were the only one who sort of spent a fair bit of your life in the family home.
Yes, our family lived there for nearly 100 years.
So you were very brave. And fearful of the water or sea or not?
I was okay, but I must admit my sister, most of her life she's lived away from Felixstowe, but 10 years ago she moved back here.
Oh, right.
She was looking for a flat, and she would not contemplate living
anywhere near
in the West End.
No.
And I've only been moved about six years or so.
Right. Yeah.
So I miss being near the sea, but
there is something about the sea, isn't there? The sort of the refresh, the blow, and it's always different and changing.
Yes.
But it's always needed to be treated with great respect, you know. And I do wonder whether we should be building even more housing on you know, sort of in vulnerable areas on sand, when really you haven't got to. You could be going somewhere else. Because what I heard, and perhaps you can confirm this, the prefabs were, I think, there were 4 different locations within Felixstowe, and the ones that were down they were positioned there. A lot of local people said, well, that is subject to flooding. You really, you know, you should really think about this. I mean, I don't know what the evidence is for that, but it's something that perhaps we should look into as to, you know, why would you? I mean, prefabs were lovely. We had them in my village in Devon, and for young marrieds, they were, you know, very, very desperate to get in. But then, in those days, the housing situation was nearly as bad as it's now become again, isn't it? But then, at least they were building things and they were available.
Well, I can only remember stories, but as far as the prefabs were concerned, we always used to hear that whenever there was any small amount of water coming across the prom,
right,
and then going down and perhaps
the overtopping,
just about hitting the prefabs, they always used to say, "That's fine, we've had it before, we'll sweep it out in the morning."
Really?
Now, we have heard stories that people were warned on the night.
Well, that's what I'm trying to find, and I can't
there's no confirmation. I mean, these are our stories, but we heard that people would say, "Yes, that's okay, we've had it before, we'll sweep it out on the night." But unfortunately,
because I'm told there was a deal of overtopping, because there was a dance apparently at the pavilion, and there were a lot of people there from Ipswich, and apparently they went back on the train from Beach Station Road. So there was topping, and it was sort of going into Langer, because that's the only place you can head to, isn't it, really, once it goes over. But I'm not sure what time the dance ended, or even what time the train left.
No.
So it's trying to get a real tight timetable of what things happened when and where. So hopefully, if we can find a sponsor out there who might be prepared to help us do perhaps a more complete historic piece of research, and we can get St Edmund's Hall to make themselves available on the third Sunday in September, perhaps we can gather a bit more information, and because these things are going to go even further away from us, aren't they? By the time the next anniversary comes, you will be...
Well,
you're not going to be 28, are you?
No.
No.
Yeah, right.
No. And I shan't ask. But, you know, and so a lot of the information that we should be retrieving, because we do need to, don't we, to have a full picture of what really happened.
But I wouldn't hesitate to live where I lived again. But I wouldn't live in a bungalow. I wouldn't mind living in a bungalow which had got a garage underneath.
Oh, right.
But I wouldn't have any doubt problem with living there again.
But you see, the Dutch, they approach this in a completely different manner. They actually have buildings and houses that float.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
So, you know, you've got 4 anchor points, and then it doesn't really... But then it's built to accommodate... We don't do that, do we? We sort of put it in there.
But there was houseboats along the river
Yes,
wall.
I've seen those.
And they were ex-landing craft.
And what happened to them?
Well, they did float, evidently, but the occupants were evacuated. They ended up in the ferry boat inn, and one of them spent the night. The father of one of these families in those houseboats spent the night in the toilet, the men's toilet, on top of the cistern, out of the way of the water. That's where he spent the night. How he got separated from his family, who I know went to the ferry boat.
Right.
I didn't know at the time, but I found out after. How he got separated. He was the man, because he lived along the river wall, who was supposed to open the sluices to take the pressure off the wall.
Oh, really?
To let the salt water. They had 2 or 3 sluices along there.
Right.
And whether he did that or not, I suppose he did, because we used to see it open now and again.
Yeah.
But that wall, the water used to come up that wall. When the water topped the saltings, that was a good tide. But it had got to be a very good tide to top over the wall, especially after, when we lived there first, just after, well, I was born in 42.
Right.
The wall, you could hardly see the wall, it's so low, but topping it up 3 feet in 1949,
made a difference.
And then again after the 53, and then again since, sheet piling it and leaving it another 2 foot.
Right.
It's not dangerous now.
One thing you can perhaps help me with, apparently there was grave concern that there was to be another high tide after the event of the 31st and the 1st. So they actually had to get the breaches at least partially filled very quickly. Do you have any memory of any of that?
We have memories for months and months. J&B or J&J Edwards was a contracting firm, and they used to walk past our bungalow, and this was well after 2 or 3 weeks after,
Right.
But they were filling these breaches further up the river.
That was at the ferry.
Further up the river. They weren't. I don't think they were worried about it coming in again.
No.
Because they say although in Holland I heard on the radio yesterday they had another big tide.
Yeah, they did.
The next tide.
And we were frightened of it.
But yeah,
here.
but
And it may well have been at the breach for the Orwell rather than the Devon.
But
you've got no memory of
no memory at all of that.
I don't think it did.
Because you know they'd have had to have got to the breaches.
Yes.
I mean, the reason it's perhaps the reason I'm inquiring. I was told that the Devon Regiment was here at that time, or at least they were drafted in, along with the American Air Force, the Royal Air Force, and a number of other bodies, and they were the ones who provided the manpower because there wasn't the sort of the current machinery we have now, and it was very much a manpower thing, and they had to get along the riverbank to get into the hold to do the filling, and it was quite an amazing, which they did in a very short space of time. And the real question, I suppose now we would have machinery that could do it, but we wouldn't have that amount of manpower available at the pretty much a drop of a hat, which is what must have. So that's something I will look into.
Yeah, I don't think they were worried about any more floods immediately.
No.
I can't see they could have been, because it was several weeks when this firm was employed. They got they got the name on their tunics.
Yeah.
But it would have been a job they used to walk past ours, so they didn't have any machinery to get there.
No,
and it would be awkward to get there.
Yeah.
Along those river walls.
Indeed.
Perhaps get it from the farm side, but.
Okay. So, what was your view of the ceremonies that were arranged yesterday? How did you feel that?
Yes, I thought that was very good. That was the first one I've been to.
Oh, right. So you didn't go to when it was originally sort of commemorated 10 years ago?
No, because I would have done had I had friends at Langdon Road School that I'd lost.
Because that was past midnight. It was freezing, and we had snow on the ground a bit, and it was a cold night. But it sort of suited what the memorial was for, because you had a little bit of the feel of just how cold and bleak that would have been on the actual night. I mean, yesterday afternoon was quite a glorious afternoon, wasn't it? I mean, a bit sharp but clear and whatever. So how do you feel this may be remembered in years to come?
Really, I've got no idea.
No. Because they were saying, weren't they, not many years ago, that we would start to forget World War I and World War II, but I note now on Remembrance Sunday there actually seems to be a lot more, whether that's Afghanistan and Iraq, I don't know, but a lot more young people tend to be down at the memorial on the seafront. So I think it's something that roots you to where you live. This is a place that this happened, and hopefully future generations, and we better talk to them now, will actually give regard to the loss of 41 individuals through no fault of their own on what must have been a terrifying, frightening night for all. So may I thank you all three for coming in.
Thank you.
I think our audience has been unbelievably quiet and attentive. Ice creams hopefully later. And let's hope we can do something come September. I think we should make some effort to do that. So if there's a sponsor out there who would be prepared to hopefully make or give us some demonstration boards, that sort of thing, we should really tell the story of the Felixstowe flood 53 in September. Thank you very much for viewing. Bye bye.